The clock on the mint green wall ticked with a soft, persistent authority, its hands inching toward 3 in the afternoon. In the kitchen, a universe contained by pale yellow cabinets and a speckled linoleum floor, the day's central ceremony was beginning. The air was still, holding only the faint scent of morning coffee and lemon-scented polish, but it was a quietude soon to be filled. From the icebox came the centerpiece, a hefty cut of chuck roast, marbled with white fat, cool and firm to the touch. Laying it on the worn wooden cutting board was the first note in a familiar symphony. Her hands moved with an efficiency born of 1,000 Tuesdays. The paring knife, its handle smooth from use, found its place in her palm. The potatoes, earthy and dimpled, were next. One by one, she peeled, the brown skins curling away in long continuous ribbons that collected in the sink like rustic confetti. The sound was a soft, rhythmic scratch, a whisper against the ceramic. The peeled potatoes, now pale and damp, went into a large bowl of cold water where they would wait, their starchy flesh preserved. Then came the onions, their papery skins rustling as she removed them. The first slice released a sharp, pungent aroma that made her eyes prickle, a sensation so routine it felt like a part of the recipe. She blinked away the tears and continued, dicing the onions into neat uniform squares that would soon melt into sweetness. The carrots were a brighter affair. Their orange was vivid against the dull wood of the board. The chop of the knife was a fuller, more decisive sound, a solid thunk as she severed the tapered ends, followed by a quicker, lighter tap-tap-tap as she cut them into coins. Each coin was a perfect circle, a tiny sum. She scraped them into a waiting bowl, the colours a promise of the meal to come, the white of the potato, the gold of the onion, the vibrant orange of the carrot, the deep brown of the waiting roast. The heavy Dutch oven, enamelled cast iron, was lifted from its cupboard. Its weight was substantial, a trusted anchor. A knob of butter sizzled as it hit the pot's hot surface, melting into a pool of gold. The roast was patted dry, then seasoned generously with salt and pepper, the grains clinging to the moist flesh. It met the butter with a fierce, satisfying sear, a sound that filled the kitchen with a sudden aggressive life. The meat hissed and crackled, its surface browning sealing in juices. The rich, savoury scent of seared beef rose in a cloud of steam, momentarily overwhelming the sharper onion smell. This was the foundational note, deep and resonant. Once the meat was browned, she removed it and added the onions to the glistening fat. They sighed as they hit the heat, sizzling softly before settling into a gentle, translucent fry. Their sharpness mellowed, becoming fragrant and sweet. She stirred them with a wooden spoon, watching them turn from opaque white to a tender gold. This was the alchemy she understood, the transformation of raw, separate things into a cohesive whole. The carrots and potatoes were added next, along with a few cloves of garlic, their papery skins left on to perfume rather than overpower. The roast was returned to its nest of vegetables. From the tap, she filled a measuring cup with water, pouring it in until it reached halfway up the meat's side. A final sprinkle of salt, a bay leaf dropped in like a secret. The lid settled onto the pot with a definitive, heavy clunk. The flame beneath was lowered to the merest whisper, a blue halo of heat. Now the waiting began. The Bart. Kitchen returned to a different kind of quiet, one humming with potential. The only sounds were the faint, bubbling murmur from the pot and the relentless, gentle tick of the clock. Steam began to seep from under the lid's edge, a visible breath carrying the compounded scents of the simmering meal. It fogged the window over the sink, softening the view of the tidy backyard. She wiped her hands on her checkered apron, the damp cloth rough against her skin. A quiet pride, bone deep and wordless, settled in her chest alongside a familiar fatigue. Her back ached from standing, and a faint smear of flour dusted her forearm. This was her domain, her creation. For the next few hours, the pot would work its slow magic, and she would move through the ancillary tasks, setting the table with the good ceramic plates, their weight substantial and comforting, polishing the water glasses until they squeaked, folding the linen napkins into precise triangles. Each action was a stitch in the fabric of the evening. At precisely 10 minutes to 6, she would lift the pot's lid. A great fragrant plume of steam would billow out, carrying the essence of the afternoon's labour. The meat would be fork tender, falling apart at the gentlest pressure. The vegetables would have soaked up the rich, savoury broth, becoming soft and flavourful. She would carefully transfer it all to a large serving platter. The gravy poured into a matching boat. The dishes, warmed in the oven, would be heavy in her hands as she carried them to the dining room table, already gleaming under the overhead light. At 6 o'clock, the front door would open, the sound of her husband's briefcase being set down, the thump of children's shoes, the murmur of voices shaking off the outside world. These were her cues. They would gather, drawn by the aroma, their faces expectant. The meal would commence with a quiet grace, the only words a brief prayer of thanks. The unspoken rules would govern. No elbows on the table, please. Pass the salt. Don't reach. Chew with your mouth closed. Conversation would be gentle, revolving around school, work, the small news of the day, the clink of forks on plates, the soft tear of bread, the ladle scraping against the gravy boat. These were the rhythms of communion. In this space, at this time, the fatigue would recede, replaced by a profound, if fleeting, sense of order and fulfillment. The kitchen, now warm and smelling of accomplishment, would rest behind her, its clock ticking toward the next ritual, its rhythm the steady heartbeat of the home. The waiting room of Dr. Tymonton Ellis's office smelled of antiseptic and mint, a sterile bubble suspended in the quiet hum of a Tuesday afternoon. You sat, hands folded over your purse, trying to ignore the low thrum of anxiety that always accompanied a dental cleaning. The only distraction was a low table strewn with magazines, their covers bright promises of better gardens, newer hairstyles, and happier marriages. Your gaze drifted, uninsured, until it caught on a splash of colour so bold it seemed to vibrate against the muted greens and browns of the room. It was a full-page advertisement in Life magazine, left splayed open as if by providence. The headline shouted in a cheerful, futuristic font, Swanson TV dinners. A complete meal without a plate. The artwork was a marvel of modern illustration. Not a photograph, but a vibrant painting of perfection. In the foreground, a stylized aluminum tray gleamed as if lit from within, its 3 compartments holding a miniature feast that defied the laws of home economics. A slice of turkey, golden brown and impossibly juicy, rested beside a mound of dressing that looked both fluffy and crisp. In the next compartment, a heap of peas, each one a perfect emerald sphere, glistened next to cubes of orange carrot. The third section held a cloud of whipped potatoes, peaked like a snowy mountain range, with a perfect crater of gravy pooled at its base. It was a meal engineered for the eye, pristine and contained. The text made bold, declarative promises. No shopping, no chopping, no cooking, it proclaimed. Just heat and serve in 25 minutes. The copy spoke of freedom, of time recaptured, of joining the family in the living room for the Milton Berle show. Instead of being sequestered in the kitchen, a smiling, impeccably dressed family was depicted not around a dining table, but on a plush sofa, each member holding their own individual tray, their faces turned in delight toward an unseen television screen. Their togetherness was not in the sharing of a platter, but in the shared experience of entertainment, their meals as personal as their opinions of the program. The ad was a window into a different world, one where the slow, aromatic alchemy of the Dutch oven was replaced by the swift, scientific certainty of the oven timer. The hygienist called your name, and the vision was tucked away, but it lingered at the edge of your thoughts throughout the scraping and polishing, a persistent, glossy daydream. Later, at home, as you assembled a meatloaf with hands that still smelled of Dr. Ellis's peppermint soap, the image returned. That evening, after the dishes were washed and the kitchen restored to order, the family gathered in the living room. The radio was on, a symphony of crackling news and smooth advertisements. Then a familiar jingle played, followed by an announcer's booming, confident voice extolling the virtues of the Swanson TV dinner. Your husband, Paul, looked up from his newspaper with a snort. "A meal in a box," he said, his voice a mixture of amusement and disdain. "Next, they'll be selling us air in a can. What's wrong with a proper dinner on a proper plate?" He shook the paper firmly, a gesture of dismissal. For him, the world of glossy ads was separate from the real world of mortgages, lawn care, and the satisfying heft of a steak. But the children, Billy and Susan, were captivated. Billy, sprawled on the rug with a model airplane, paused his work. "Your own tray?" he asked, his eyes wide. "With separate little spots for everything?" Like in a lunchroom, the novelty appealed to his sense of order and ownership. Susan, older and more pragmatic, considered the promise of speed. 25 minutes, then we could eat earlier and listen to Dimension X all the way through without having to get up, she mused, already calculating the gain in entertainment. They saw not a dilution of tradition, but an exciting upgrade, a piece of the futuristic world promised by comic books and newsreels. You said nothing, your hands busy darning a sock in the lamplight, but inside a quiet conflict stirred. A part of you, The part that ached at 4:30 with the prospect of another hour of peeling and simmering felt an undeniable flicker of curiosity. What would it be like to have that hour back? To read a magazine, or simply sit without the weight of the next meal pressing on your thoughts? The ad's promise of freedom whispered seductively, painting a picture of an easier, more modern you. Yet intertwined with that curiosity was a deep instinctive unease. The meal in the ad, for all its colourful perfection, looked lonely. Each person isolated on their own square of aluminum, their attention directed at a screen, not at each other across a table. Where was the shared platter, the passing of dishes, the gentle inquiry about a second helping? The ritual you had maintained, with its quiet pride and profound fatigue, was more than nourishment. It was the daily reaffirmation of the family unit, a tangible expression of care. Could care be packaged in cardboard and frozen? The idea felt like a betrayal of something sacred, a silent surrender of a role that, while exhausting, defined the very rhythm of your days. The whisper from the future was both alluring and unsettling, a siren song of convenience that threatened to quiet the heartbeat of the kitchen you had just left, still warm from the day's labour. The following Saturday morning held a different kind of promise, one of exploration rather than routine. The new A&P had finally opened on the edge of town, a sprawling, flat-roofed temple of modernity replacing the familiar, cramped corner grocer. You pushed through the heavy glass doors and the world shifted. A wave of artificially chilled air, scented with floor wax and something indefinably new, washed over you. The space was a cavern of light, vast and echoing, with ceilings so high they seemed to dissolve in the glare of long rows of fluorescent tubes humming overhead. The light was relentless, bleaching colour into a strange, vibrant flatness and casting no soft shadows. Beneath your feet, the linoleum was a sea of speckled beige, polished to a high, slippery sheen that reflected the blaze above. The sensory assault was deliberate, overwhelming. Gone was the dim, wood-panelled coziness of Mr. Henderson's store, with its dusty shelves and the perpetual smell of coffee beans and old apples. Gone was the necessity of reciting a list to a man in an apron who would fetch items from behind a counter. Here you were adrift in a silent, gleaming landscape of abundance, a navigator of your own choices. The aisles stretched into the distance like canyons bordered by towering cliffs of brightly coloured packages. The sheer volume of everything was staggering. Pyramids of canned corn, regiments of soup, a kaleidoscopic wall of cereal boxes featuring cartoon mascots with grinning faces. It was a monument to post-war plenty, a dizzying display of option where there had once been simple necessity. You gripped the handle of a wire shopping basket, its metal cool and unfamiliar. The basket felt absurdly light, a vessel waiting to be filled by your own will. The freedom was disorienting. You moved slowly, your shoes squeaking on the polished floor, your eyes wide. The store was quiet, but for the distant tinny melody of muzak and the soft rustle of other shoppers, fellow explorers in this bright new world. You selected items with a conscious deliberation, each choice feeling strangely significant. A can of coffee, its label brash and red, a box of gelatin promising shimmering desserts. a bag of sugar, plain and heavy. The basket began to gain weight, its wire frame pressing into the crook of your arm, a tangible proof of progress. The journey through the aisles felt like a pilgrimage through a new American geography. You passed the dairy case, a long humming coffin of glass, revealing perfectly aligned quarts of milk and bricks of butter wrapped in foil. You navigated the bakery section, where loaves of pre-sliced bread were stacked in soft uniform towers, their wrappers whispering promises of freshness. At the meat counter, a man in a white coat stood behind a long glass case, but the cuts were already packaged in cellophane and styrofoam, priced and waiting, their relationship to a living animal rendered abstract and clean. Your list was nearly complete, the basket now substantially heavy. Then you turned a corner, and the air grew noticeably colder, carrying a faint metallic tang. Before you stretched the freezer aisle, a long corridor of gleaming white cabinets topped with frosted glass lids. Inside, under the misty glass, lay a new frozen world. Bricks of orange juice concentrate, boxes of fish sticks, bags of petite peas. Your breath caught, and there at the end of the aisle, stacked in a neat towering pyramid on a promotional cardboard display, were the boxes. They were just as the ad had promised, but more real, more solid. Swanson TV-Dinners. The boxes were a cheerful riot of colour against the white and silver of the freezer, each one a miniature billboard featuring that same idealised painting of turkey, dressing, peas and potatoes. A small printed sign below them boasted, "Try the future of feeding your family." You stood still, the weight of your basket forgotten, at the threshold of a decision that felt far larger than the purchase of a meal. The cold radiated from the frosted glass lid in a palpable wave, raising goosebumps on your arms as you stood before the pyramid of boxes. You reached out, your fingers hesitating for a moment before making contact. The cardboard was shockingly cold, a dry, penetrating chill that seeped into your skin. You lifted a single Swanson turkey dinner from the middle of the stack, careful not to topple the carefully balanced tower. The box was surprisingly light, almost disappointingly so. In your hands, the Tuesday pot roast, with its dense, comforting heft, felt like a memory from another century. You turned the box over, studying it. The front was a burst of impossible colour, the painted turkey glistening with a sheen real oven could produce. The peas were a uniform, cartoonish green, each one perfectly spherical and separate. It was a promise of perfection, a guarantee against the variables of a simmering pot. No undercooked potatoes, no gravy that broke, no carrots that turned to mush. The back panel was a grid of text and diagrams, heating instructions that read like a laboratory procedure, a nutritional breakdown that reduced a meal to numbers, a list of ingredients that included words like hydrolyzed vegetable protein and emulsifier. This was food as science, not craft. A practical calculation began in your mind, a silent arithmetic of modern life. The price, 98 cents, was noted. You mentally tallied the cost of the chuck roast, the vegetables, the butter, the gas for the long simmer. The homemade meal was cheaper, unquestionably. But then you added the invisible costs, the hour of peeling and chopping, the half hour of active tending, the constant low-grade attention of the simmer. You quantified the fatigue in your lower back from standing at the counter, the faint oil burn on your wrist from the spitting butter. The TV dinner's price suddenly included a rebate on time and effort, a currency the grocery ledger never accounted for. Yet, holding the cold box, you felt the weight of a different judgment. It was the imagined gaze of your mother, who had cooked through the depression, for whom wasting fuel on a pre-cooked meal would be unthinkable extravagance. It was the potential raised eyebrow from Marge next door, who took pride in her from-scratch casseroles. It was the echo of Paul's dismissive snort from the living room. To choose this box was to publicly admit a kind of surrender, to acknowledge that the sacred duty of the homemade could be compromised for mere convenience. The freezer aisle felt suddenly exposed under the relentless fluorescent lights, a stage for a private failing. But then a rebellious spark, small and fierce, ignited in your chest. This wasn't just laziness, this was a choice. An act of agency in a world that prescribed your every move. Selecting this box was a silent vote for a different kind of evening. A small reclaiming of a lost hour for yourself. It was a tentative step into the future. Everyone kept talking about your fingers tightened around the cardboard. With a furtive glance down the empty aisle, you opened your wire basket and placed the single, lightweight box inside. It settled between the heavy bag of sugar and the loaf of bread, a quiet interloper. You did not take two. One was an experiment. Two would be a declaration. This was a secret. A modern rebellion conducted in the heart of the temple of consumption. You closed the basket, the wire latch clicking with finality, and walked quickly toward the checkout, the cold of the box seeming to pulse against your leg. With every step, a thrilling, guilty secret frozen in cardboard. The cardboard box sat on the kitchen counter, a silent, rectangular intruder in the late afternoon sun. The journey from the supermarket freezer to this familiar space felt like a transgression, a buxom artifact from a foreign world deposited on the shores of routine. You placed your purse down slowly, the act of unpacking the groceries now holding a charged ceremonial air. The staples, the flour, the coffee, the can of peaches were put away with automatic motions, restoring the known order. But the Swanson box remained, its cheerful illustration glaringly bright against the muted formica. Finally, alone in the quiet kitchen, you addressed it. Your fingers found the top flap. The cardboard made a distinct, dry crinkle, a sound utterly unlike the soft rustle of a paper grocery bag, or the heavy thump of a meat-wrapped package from the butcher. It was a hollow, manufactured noise. You peeled back the flap, revealing not food, but more packaging, a sheath of thin, translucent paper covering the contents. You lifted it out. Beneath the paper lay the object itself, and for a moment you simply stared. It was a tray, but unlike any dish you owned, made of a thin, slightly flexible aluminum. It was divided into 3 perfect rectangular compartments by raised ridges of the same metal. The divisions were absolute, creating a stark geometric landscape of separate zones. In one compartment lay a pale breaded slab, the turkey. In the next, a compact mound of orange dressing. The third held a frozen amalgam of peas, carrot cubes, and what you presumed were the whipped potatoes, though they were currently a solid frosted white block. A smaller fourth depression at the top cradled a frozen disc of gravy, a dark brown puck. The entire assembly was covered by a single sheet of aluminum foil, pressed tightly around the edges, sealing the frozen world within. The sight was both fascinating and faintly unsettling. This was not a meal in progress. It was a finished product. A fossilized dinner. The artistry of your Dutch oven, where flavors mingled and married, was here replaced by a policy of strict segregation. The instructions on the box were studied with the intensity of a chemist reviewing a novel formula. Preheat oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. Remove foil cover. Place tray on baking sheet in center of oven. Heat for 30 minutes. The directives were clear, devoid of the intuitive whispers of experience, until golden brown, until fork tender. This was a binary process, time and temperature. You lit the oven, the gas catching with a soft whump, and watched the dial slowly climb. The act felt strangely impersonal. There was no butter to melt, no roast to sear, no aromatic foundation to build. You simply waited for the machine to reach the specified number. When the oven chimed readiness, you placed the frozen aluminum tray directly onto a baking sheet, as instructed. The foil cover was peeled off. It came away with a faint, tinny sigh. The revealed dinner looked even more austere in its naked, frozen state, the colours dull under the kitchen light. You slid it into the hot oven and closed the door. The timer was set with a twist of the wrist. Another scientific parameter. Then there was nothing to do. No vegetables to stir, no gravy to skim, no need to baste. You wiped your already clean hands on your apron, feeling oddly dislocated. The kitchen was silent but for the hum of the oven and the ticking clock. You were a spectator to your own meal's preparation. After 10 minutes, the smells began to change the air. It was not the slow, layered unfolding of scents from a pot roast. The initial sear, the sweetening onion, the earthy carrot. This was a singular, composite aroma that announced itself all at once. It was savoury and salty, with a top note of something vaguely poultry-like, but underneath ran a current of pasteboard, heated aluminum. It was a warm, industrial smell, familiar from the diner downtown, yet alien here in your kitchen. It lacked the herbal depth of a bay leaf, the richness of meat juices reducing. This was a smell of efficiency, not evolution. As the timer counted down, you performed the second rebellious act. From the hall closet, you retrieved the folding tray tables, their wooden legs stiff from disuse. You carried them into the living room, their folded forms awkward in your arms. Unfolding them before the sofa felt like a breach of an unspoken, fundamental protocol. The kitchen table, with its sturdy legs and woven placemats, was the ordained altar for consumption. These flimsy tables, with their painted tops and rickety hinges, were for children's games or the rare summer lemonade on the porch. Setting them up in a row before the television felt like moving the sanctuary into the entertainment hall. You placed a paper napkin and a fork on each tray, the ordinary silverware looking somehow too substantial, too real, for the aluminum feast to come. The oven timer buzzed, a sharp, electric sound. You returned to the kitchen, donned an oven mitt, and pulled out the baking sheet. The transformation was startling. The aluminum tray now shimmered with heat, the compartments bubbling vigorously. The once pale turkey slab had browned into a credible imitation of roasted meat. The gravy puck had melted into a glossy brown pool that had seeped slightly into the neighbouring potatoes, which had puffed into a pale, peaked mass. The peas and carrots glistened, their colours now vibrant. Steam rose in a fragrant, salty cloud. Using the mitt, you transferred each blazing tray directly onto the waiting tray tables, the aluminum scorching little rings into the painted wood. The living room, formerly a domain of evening quiet and radio voices, was now filled with the smell of the future, and the stage was set for a new kind of communion. The living room had been transformed into a dim, flickering cavern, the only illumination emanating from the 12-inch screen of the television set. Its phosphorescent glow painted the familiar space in shades of pulsating grey and blue, casting long, dancing shadows behind the furniture. The set hummed a warm electronic note, a backdrop to the brassy theme music of I Love Lucy. Before the screen, in a neat row, the 3 folding tray tables stood like minimalist altars, each bearing its own shimmering, steaming aluminum platter. The family took their places, not in the carved dining chairs, but in the soft, yielding depths of the sofa and an overstuffed armchair, their bodies angled toward the electronic hearth. The ritual had been uprooted and replanted in this new informal soil. The first touch was metallic. The tines of your fork scraped against the aluminum compartment as you attempted to spear a pea. The sound was a high, thin scree-cray, a note of industrial table music, utterly foreign to the gentle chime of porcelain. You adjusted your angle, learning the new technique required, a careful scooping motion from the side to avoid the auditory protest of metal on metal. The fork, when lifted to your mouth, carried a faint, cool tang, a ghost of the tray's essence, transferred to the food. It was the taste of the factory, of the freezer aisle, a subtle metallic whisper underlying the first bite. The food itself was a series of small, surprising revelations. The turkey, expecting a dry, compressed blandness, yielded with a surprising tenderness. It was moist, seasoned with a pervasive, salty savour that spoke more of brine and process than of roasting herbs. The dressing was the true shock. It was not the loose, crumbly, celery-flecked stuffing of Thanksgiving memory, but a dense, cohesive square, almost cake-like in its texture, with a dominant flavour of sage and onion powder that was somehow both potent and one-dimensional. Yet it was not unpleasant. It was consistent, each bite an exact replica of the last, a guarantee against the occasional dry corner or unevenly seasoned mouthful of the homemade version. The gravy, pooled in its designated well and creeping into the potatoes, was the star. It was a smooth, velvety brown river, unbroken by a single lump, its sheen perfect under the TV's glow. Its flavour was deeply, unapologetically savoury, a concentrated essence of roasted meat that, while lacking the nuanced depth of pan drippings and careful reduction, delivered an immediate, potent satisfaction. It coated the fork-tender turkey and the whipped potatoes with a uniform richness that was in its own efficient way deeply comforting. The potatoes themselves were a marvel of texture, airy and smooth as beaten cream, holding their shape yet dissolving on the tongue without the slightest graininess. They were a perfect vehicle, a bland, fluffy cloud for the bold gravy. The children were enchanted, not by the flavour, but by the novel architecture of the meal. Billy, his face bathed in the shifting blue light from a Lucy pratfall, meticulously ate one compartment clean before moving to the next, treating each section as a sovereign state whose borders were not to be violated. "I like the walls," he announced, tapping his fork against the aluminum ridge. "It keeps the gravy in its place." For him, the order was a delight. Susan ate with a contemplative air, glancing between her tray and the television. "It's like being at the movies, but with dinner," she said, a statement that perfectly captured the fusion of sustenance and spectacle. Their conversation was sporadic, directed not at each other, but at the images on the screen. A laugh at Lucy's antics, a muttered, "Oh, Ricky." These were the communal utterances now. Your spouse, Paul, ate with a methodical slowness, his eyes mostly on his tray. He took a bite of the peas, chewed thoughtfully, and finally offered his review. "Peas are a bit soft," he said, his tone not critical, merely observational, as if assessing a new brand of motor oil. It was the only commentary on the food's quality. He did not remark on the tenderness of the turkey or the excellence of the gravy. His observation was a small, quiet anchor to the world of culinary standards, a minor testament that even in this futuristic meal, some traditional metrics of domness still applied. He then turned his attention back to the screen, his fork moving steadily from compartment to compartment, a silent acceptance of the new format. A profound quiet settled over the room, broken only by the canned laughter from the television and the soft metallic scrapes of forks on trays, the deep connective conversation of the dining table, the inquiries about the day, the small plans for the weekend, was absent. There was no shared platter to pass, no second helping ritual, no collective focus on the act of breaking bread together. The focus was bifurcated. Between the private individual experience of consuming one's own compartmentalized meal and the shared but passive experience of watching Lucy stuff chocolates into her uniform. The togetherness was parallel, not intersecting, yet within that quiet the shift occurred. It was not dramatic, but deep, seismic in its subtlety. The anxiety, the guilt, the sense of transgression you had carried from the supermarket began to melt away, warmed by the simple, undeniable practicality of the moment. Here was a hot, palatable meal. Here was a family together, relaxed. Here was an hour of your life, not spent scrubbing a pot crusted with roasted onions, but spent in the same room as your children's laughter. The aluminum tray, now holding only smears of gravy and a few orphaned peas, was not a symbol of neglect, but of time reclaimed. The glow from the television was no longer just illumination. It was the light of a new possibility, flickering over the remains of an old ritual, quietly rewriting the rules of care and connection without a single word of discussion. The kitchen, dark and silent down the hall felt suddenly distant, its clock ticking toward an obsolete hour. Thursday arrived breathless and crowded, a day where minutes bled into one another and the to-do list mocked from its nail on the wall. A morning of frantic errands was followed by an afternoon assisting with the school book fair, leaving you returning home at 4:30 with a dull headache and the certain knowledge that the pantry offered no inspiration for a 6 o'clock meal. The thought of the Dutch oven, of peeling, searing and simmering, sent a wave of genuine fatigue so deep it felt like vertigo. Your eyes went, almost of their own volition, to the freezer. There, beside the ice cube tray and a half-empty box of peas, sat the remaining 2 Swanson TV dinners, purchased on a subsequent, less furtive trip to the A&P. Their presence was no longer a secret. It was a contingency plan. Tonight, the plan was activated. The process was now familiar, stripped of its first-time ceremony. The oven was lit. The frozen trays were placed on the baking sheet, their foil covers removed with a practiced pull. As they heated, you set up the tray tables in the living room with an efficiency that felt both guilty and liberating. In the 25 minutes of prescribed cooking time, you accomplished what would have been impossible had you been chained to the stove. You retrieved Susan's Sunday dress from the mending basket, the one with the torn hem from a triumphant but reckless climb on the playground monkey bars. Sitting in the quiet living room with the oven humming a distant promise from the kitchen, you took needle and thread and performed careful, invisible stitches. The rhythmic pull of the thread through the cotton was meditative, a tangible act of care that felt direct and personal. The dress was made whole again. Then, for a few minutes, you simply sat. You did not jump up to check on boiling water or stir a sauce. You looked out the front window at the maple tree, its leaves just beginning to hint at a turn toward gold. You listened to the absolute quiet of the house, a silence not pregnant with the next culinary task, but simply peaceful. You finished the hem, knotted the thread, and bit it off. The dress, folded neatly, was set aside. A full 10 minutes remained on the oven timer. The grace of those empty minutes was a physical sensation, a lightness in your chest. This was time carved out of the granite block of the day, a secret chamber of stillness you had been granted permission to enter. But as the timer buzzed and you retrieved the steaming trays, the guilt descended, a cold counterpoint to the aluminum's heat. Serving them felt, in that moment, like a confession of inadequacy. Were you so poor a manager of your time that you could not orchestrate a proper meal? Was the family's nourishment worth less than a mended hem and 10 minutes of idle staring? The sacred duty of the homemaker, a mantle passed down through generations of women who had made do with far less and still produced steaming from-scratch meals, felt shrugged from your shoulders. You carried the trays into the living room, their sizzling a cheerful sound that now seemed accusatory. You were shirking. The word echoed in your mind, sharp and old-fashioned. Shirking your post, your calling, your love made edible. The family assembled with a casual ease that underscored the shift. There was no gathering at the sound of the dinner bell, no ceremonial bringing of platters to the table. They drifted in, drawn by the smell and the promise of the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. The meal was consumed amidst the show's gentle banter. Billy enthused about a new friend at school between bites of turkey. Susan recounted a funny line from her English teacher. Paul mentioned a project at work nearing completion. The conversation was light, effortless, woven into the entertainment rather than competing with it. The guilt, watching them, began to soften at the edges. They were not deprived. They were fed, they were together, and they were relaxed. Their comfort was not diminished by the geometry of their plates. Afterward, as you collected the empty trays, the aluminum cool now bearing only grease patterns and a few stray crumbs, the internal debate continued. The care you had taken with the dress was no less an act of love than the care required to braise a pot roast. It was simply a different currency of attention. The modern world, with its freezers and its television networks, was offering a new equation. Care could be measured not only in the slow simmer, but in the presence granted by the saved hour. The redefinition felt blasphemous, and yet undeniably practical. You are not abandoning your duty. You are negotiating its terms in a world that had suddenly accelerated. Washing the trays was a swift affair under the hot tap, the gravy and potato residue dissolving almost instantly. No scrubbing of baked-on crusts. No soaking of a heavy pot. The kitchen was restored to order in 5 minutes flat. The extra hour, now fully realized, stretched before you like a gift. You joined the family in the living room for the entirety of the television program, your mending basket beside you, your hands idle in your lap. The guilt did not vanish, but it made room for the grace. It was the grace of time, of a breath held and then slowly released. It was the grace of understanding that devotion could wear a new, more convenient face, and that perhaps in this bright, demanding new age, grace itself sometimes arrived, not as a blessing from above, but as a frozen rectangle in a cardboard box, offering a weary woman an evening of rest. The morning after the hectic Thursday was clear and cool, a pristine September day that demanded airing out the house. You carried a basket of damp laundry into the backyard, the clothespins held in your teeth. The scent of soap and sunlight on the sheets, a simple pleasure. The rhythmic snap of cotton and linen being shaken out and pinned to the line was a meditation. It was during this peaceful task that Marge appeared at the fence, her own basket propped on her hip, a familiar figure in a faded floral house dress. "Beautiful drying day," she called, her voice carrying the comfortable cadence of a decade of neighborly exchanges. You agreed, pinning a pillowcase. The conversation meandered through the safe, well-trodden topics, the children's back-to-school adjustments, the persistent crabgrass in the lawn, the price of coffee. Then, as you reached for a final clothespin, Marge's tone shifted, adopting a conspiratorial lilt that was both humorous and probing. "Say," she began, nodding her head subtly towards the side of your house where the trash cans were kept. "I couldn't help but notice a couple of those Swanson boxes in your bin on pickup day, the ones with the little turkey picture." She paused, letting the observation hang in the sun-dappled air. Twice now, you felt a faint, familiar heat rise to your cheeks, the same blend of defiance and sheepishness you'd felt at the supermarket freezer. The private experiment had been spotted, catalogued, You kept your eyes on the laundry line, giving a non-committal hum as you smoothed the wrinkle from the sheet. Marge leaned her elbows on the top of the white-painted fence. My Harold saw an ad for them. He got a real chuckle. "What's the world coming to?" Marge said. He said. "Food from a factory, eaten in front of a picture box." She imitated her husband's basso grumble with affectionate accuracy. I told him it was surely just a fad, like the hula hoop. Here today, gone tomorrow. Her words were a gentle probe, wrapped in the guise of sharing a marital anecdote. You found your voice, aiming for a tone of casual, modern rationality. "There's certainly a convenience on a rushed evening," you offered, turning to face her. "The children think they're a treat." "A treat," Marge echoed, her eyebrows rising. "Well, I suppose, like candy for dinner." She smiled to take the sting out of it, but the judgment, however mild, was present. It was the judgment of the shared unspoken code. From scratch equaled care. Convenience hinted at corners cut. I just can't imagine it tastes like much. All frozen and then heated up. The vegetables must be like mush. You were about to defend the peas, which were, in fact, a bit soft when Marge's expression shifted. A flicker of something like guilt passed over her own face. She glanced over her shoulder toward her own kitchen window, then leaned a fraction closer. "Well," she said, her voice dropping, "don't tell Harold I said this. He'd have a fit. But the girls served them at Bridge Club last week. Evelyn did. She said it left her free to actually concentrate on her bids instead of fussing with a hot dish." The revelation was a small seismic event in the quiet backyard. Marge, a pillar of the neighbourhood's culinary traditionalism, was admitting complicity. Not in her own home, not for her family, but in the sacred social space of her weekly bridge game. It was a crack in the monolithic front of disapproval. "Did you try one?" you asked, unable to mask your curiosity. Marge made a show of reluctance, but her eyes sparkled with the shared secret. I had to be polite. It was the turkey one. She paused, constructing her review. The gravy was surprisingly good, very savoury, and the potatoes were smoother than any I've ever whipped. I'll give them that. But the dressing... She shook her head, a genuine laugh escaping her. It was like eating a seasoned sponge. We all had a giggle over it. Betty said it reminded her of the stuffing in her sofa cushions. The two of you laughed then, a real, relaxed sound that carried across the clipped grass. The tension dissipated, replaced by the camaraderie of women navigating a changing world. The TV dinner was no longer a symbol of your personal failing, but a shared curiosity, a social object to be dissected and discussed. "So what is the world coming to, Marge?" you asked, echoing her husband's question with a lighter tone. She sighed, a long expressive sound that held generations of womanly labour. "Oh, I don't know. Faster, I suppose. Sometimes I think my mother would faint clean away if she saw a meal served on a tray from a box. But then," she added, straightening up and picking up her now empty laundry basket, "my mother also washed clothes on a scrub board. I'm not giving up my wringer washer for anything." The analogy was perfect. Convenience, once adopted and proven, became its own tradition. She turned to go, then looked back. You know they're having a special on them at the A&P, 10 cents off if you buy 3, for when you have one of those evenings. It was an absolution and a recommendation, wrapped in the language of grocery sales. She offered a final, knowing wink before disappearing into her own house. You stood by the clothesline, the sun warm on your shoulders. The conversation replayed in your mind. The social ripple effect was now visible. It had moved from a glossy ad to your secret purchase, to your family's living room, to the gossip over a backyard fence, and now, remarkably, to the bridge club. It was being normalized, not by grand pronouncements, but by these small, whispered admissions between women. It was tested in the safe, peer-governed space of a social gathering before it would ever grace a family's dinner table. The judgment was softening, melting like the gravy puck in a hot oven, transforming into a pragmatic, even humorous acceptance. The world was not ending. It was just rearranging itself. One aluminum tray, one bridge game, one neighbourly confession at a time. The laundry on the line flapped in the breeze, pure and white, a ritual unchanged for decades, while below, the grass grew over the spot where the trash cans and their telltale boxes had stood, quietly absorbing this new piece of the modern age. Saturday morning dawned with a different texture, a palpable lightness in the very air of the house. The grim clock-watching pressure that once began its slow build after lunch, the mental inventory of the larder, the early start on a simmering stew for the evening meal, was simply absent. Its absence was a space filled with quiet, unclaimed potential. The sunlight streaming through the kitchen window seemed brighter, the coffee tasted richer, and the day stretched before the family not as a corridor leading inexorably to the dinner hour, but as an open field. The liberation was collective. Paul, reading the paper at the breakfast table, looked up and suggested a drive to Miller's Pond to see if the leaves had started to turn. It was a spontaneous proposal, impossible on a Saturday just months ago, when you would have been elbow deep in flour for a pie crust by 10 o'clock. The children, hearing this, abandoned their cereal bowls with whoops of approval. There was no need to calculate the time needed to be back for potato peeling. The afternoon was a blank slate. The station wagon carried them out of the suburb and onto winding country roads. The world outside the windows was a blur of late summer green, giving way to the first hints of amber and crimson. You rode in the passenger seat, your hands idle in your lap, actually watching the scenery pass rather than mentally cataloguing pantry contents. At the pond, you spread a blanket on the grass. Billy hunted for interesting stones to skip across the glassy surface, his throws creating concentric rings that widened and vanished. Susan lay on her stomach, sketching the gnarled shape of an old willow tree. Paul pointed out a hawk circling high on a thermal. The time was not stolen. It was gifted, a full, uninterrupted block of familial presents purchased by the promise of a frozen aluminum tray waiting in the freezer back home. The meal had not been erased. It had been efficiently outsourced, its production time converted into experience. Later, on other Saturdays, the freed hours were filled with the sturdy stuff of childhood. You sat on weathered wooden bleachers under a pale blue sky, the air crisp with the scent of damp earth and cut grass. Before you, Billy, swamped in a uniform 2 sizes too big, took his position in right field with a solemnity befitting a knight guarding a castle. The crack of a bat, the muffled shouts of coaches, the gentle rhythm of the game, these were the sounds of the afternoon. You were not a distracted spectator, your mind half on a roasting chicken. You were fully there, present to cheer his cautious catch of a lazy fly ball, present to share the post-game ice cream cone, its sweetness a celebration of time spent together, rather than apart in separate rooms of the house. As the afternoon waned, the transition to evening held none of its old frantic energy. There was no last-minute basting, no frantic mashing of potatoes, no tense orchestration of having all dishes ready at the same moment. At 5:30, with the family still pleasantly tired from the fresh air, you simply walked to the freezer. The removal of the boxes was a calm, administrative task. The oven was lit. The trays, their foil lids now removed without ceremony, slid onto the rack. The timer was set. In the 25 minutes that followed, you changed out of your outdoor shoes. The children washed up without being nagged, and Paul tuned the television to the correct channel. There was a leisurely, unhurried quality to it all, a sense of everyone drifting comfortably towards the evening's entertainment rather than being summoned to a culinary summons. For the evening meal was now unequivocally synonymous with entertainment. Saturday night meant the Ed Sullivan Show. As the trays emerged sizzling from the oven and were carried into the living room, the family's anticipation was dual-faceted, for the savoury, familiar taste of the turkey dinner, and for the parade of novelty Mr. Sullivan would present. The trays were settled on laps, the lights were dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. The opening fanfare was the new dinner bell. The meal was consumed in the glow of the vaudevillian spectacle. A plate spinner from Prague commanded breathless silence, forks hovering mid-air. A performance by a Broadway star prompted soft, appreciative murmurs between bites of dressing. The comedy of a talking mouse had Billy giggling, a pea nearly escaping from his lips. Conversation was sparked by the show itself. Could he really keep all those plates going? Mother, how does the mouse talk? Creating a shared cultural experience that was interwoven with the act of eating. The nourishment was both physical and communal. Centered on the electronic hearth, the aluminum tray was the perfect vessel for this fusion. It required no admiration, demanded no ceremony, and allowed the focus to remain on the shared delight of the performance, its compartments neatly containing the meal, so the mind could be free to wander with the acrobats and singers. Yet within this new weekend rhythm, a bastion of tradition stood firm, a comforting counterpoint to the aluminum informality. Sunday remained sacrosanct. The morning was for church, the rustle of starched dresses and the clean scent of shoe polish, and the afternoon belonged, as it always had, to the formal Sunday dinner. This was the meal that refused evolution. By 1 o'clock, the kitchen was once again a realm of slow, deliberate creation. A roast chicken, not a frozen slab, was basted with butter and herbs. Potatoes were peeled by hand and whipped with real cream and butter until they were clouds of faintly yellow fluff. Gravy was painstakingly made from the pan drippings, strained and seasoned at the stove. The good china was lifted from the hutch. its delicate floral patterns familiar to your fingertips. The heavy silverware was laid out with precision. The linen tablecloth, pressed smooth, covered the dining table. The family gathered not in the casual sprawl of the living room, but in their assigned chairs. The television was off, its screen a dark, silent eye. Blessings were said, platters were passed, hands brushing, requests murmured politely. Conversation was sustained, focused on the week past and the week to come. The flavors were deeper, more complex, the products of patience and craft. This meal was not about convenience or entertainment. It was about heritage, respect, and the enduring power of a shared ritual. It was the anchor, proving that the family could embrace the new without discarding the old. The Saturday night TV dinner did not diminish the Sunday feast. It framed it, making its deliberate pace and profound communion feel even more special, more chosen. The weekend had evolved, bifurcating into two distinct modes of togetherness, one casual, convenient, and intertwined with the new national culture of television, the other formal, traditional, and preserving the intimate culture of the family itself. Both in their own way fed the hungry heart of the home. The idea arrived not as a grand plan, but as a quiet negotiation between the warring halves of your conscience. It was a Wednesday and a special television event was advertised. A 1-hour colour broadcast of Peter Pan, starring Mary Martin. The children were electric with anticipation, their usual evening restlessness, amplified by the promise of pirates and flight. The thought of confining them to the dining room's rigid chairs for a full hour before the broadcast felt like a recipe for misery. Yet the thought of reaching for the familiar Swanson boxes felt, for the first time, like a surrender. You wanted to give them the magic of the event, but also something of yourself, something that carried the fingerprint of care the aluminum tray could never replicate. The compromise took shape in the afternoon quiet. A homemade tuna noodle casserole. It was a dish of the old world, requiring actual cooking. You boiled the egg noodles until tender, drained them in the chipped colander. You opened cans of tuna, flaking the pale meat into a bowl. In a saucepan, you made a white sauce from butter, flour, and milk, stirring patiently until it thickened into a velvety cloak. You folded in the tuna and noodles, seasoned it with salt, pepper, and a pinch of paprika for colour. The final touch was a generous layer of crushed potato chips over the top, their promise of crunch a delight you knew the children loved. You assembled it in the good glass baking dish, the one usually reserved for church potlucks, and slid it into the oven. The kitchen filled with the comforting, savoury aroma of browning chips and bubbling sauce, a smell of effort, of choice. When the casserole emerged, golden and bubbling, you did not carry it to the dining room. Instead, you portioned it onto the everyday ceramic plates, the ones with the faint blue rim. You filled glasses with milk. Then you carried the laden plates into the living room, where the tray tables were already set up in a row before the television. The act felt profoundly hybrid, a grafting of two rituals. The food was born of the old covenant, the stirring, the seasoning, the watchful eye on the oven. But its consumption was to be governed by the new informality, the focus divided between fork and flickering screen. The family's reaction was a study in this new duality. They settled before the trays, their eyes already darting to the test pattern on the TV. The first bites were taken as the opening music swelled. Billy, after a mouthful, looked up, surprised. "This is fancy," he declared, his word for anything that tasted distinctly of home and not of the uniform factory savour. He ate with gusto, but his body was angled toward Neverland, his chewing slowing during the flight over London. Susan appreciated the creaminess, the specific crunch of the chips, eating with a thoughtful pleasure that acknowledged the upgrade from the standard frozen peas. Yet when Captain Hook appeared, her fork rested forgotten on her plate, her hand hovering near her mouth. Paul ate steadily, offering a quiet, "Very good, dear," his approval carrying the weight of genuine recognition for the labour involved. But he, too, was clearly more relaxed, his posture softer in the armchair than at the stiff dining table. The conversation was sparse, dictated by the on-screen action. Look at the crocodile. How are they flying? The shared experience was the broadcast. The casserole was its delicious, warm accompaniment. The love was in the cooking, in the deliberate selection of a dish you knew they cherished. The informality was in its consumption, in the acceptance that on this night magic of one kind could be enhanced by the convenience of another. Watching them, you felt the strange new shape of your family's evolving relationship with food and togetherness. It was no longer a binary choice between the sacred table and the profane tray. Here was a middle path, adaptable blend. The meal could be an act of love without being a sentence of solitary labour. Togetherness could be measured in shared wonder as well as in shared conversation. The casserole, steaming on its humble plate in the glow of the television, was neither a full retreat to the past nor a total surrender to the future. It was a bridge, a testament to the family's quiet, pragmatic ability to hold on to what nourished them from both worlds, blending them into a sustainable, modern whole. The kitchen's heartbeat and the television's glow had found, for this evening at least, a harmonious rhythm. The experiment's success was quiet but undeniable, measured in cleaned plates and contented faces bathed in the television's glow. As the credits for Peter Pan rolled and the magical glow of Neverland faded to a test pattern, you collected the empty dishes, the good ceramic plates, usually reserved for the dining room, felt like honoured guests in the casual living room, their faint blue rims smeared with the last traces of creamy sauce and golden crumbs. You carried the stack toward the kitchen, the familiar weight a comforting anchor, when Billy's voice, still bright with the afterglow of adventure, piped up from behind you. "Mom," he began, his tone thoughtful. "That was really good. The chips were the best part." He paused, a small negotiator framing his request. "But next time, could we have our plates on the trays? My legs got kind of tired holding my plate." Susan, folding her tray table with a practical air, nodded in agreement. "It's easier to balance," she added, her logic impeccable, "and you don't have to worry about spilling on the sofa." You stopped in the doorway, the dishes heavy in your hands. The request was simple, practical, born of physical comfort and a child's straightforward logic, yet in that moment it illuminated the subtle, profound shift that had already taken root. The casserole had been your bridge, your offering of homemade love, within the new paradigm of informal viewing. But the children, in their innocent feedback, had pointed to the true symbol of that new paradigm. It wasn't the television itself, or even the frozen food. It was the tray, the humble folding tray table with its rickety hinges and painted top had transcended its function. It had become an icon of casual, comfortable dining. It represented permission. Permission to relax one's posture, to focus on entertainment rather than etiquette, to inhabit a space of leisure while eating. The tray created a personal, bounded territory for the meal, a small stage that made the individual feel catered to, even when the food was served family style from a shared dish. The good china plate, for all its weight and tradition, demanded a formality the living room had quietly abolished. The tray, however, was the native furniture of this new hybrid space. It was the accommodating host where the ceramic plate was now a visitor. This realization settled over you in the quiet kitchen as you ran hot water into the sink. The soap bubbles multiplied, a cloud of iridescence. You washed the glass casserole dish first, scrubbing at the baked-on cheese at the edges, the labor feeling righteous and familiar. Then you washed the everyday plates, their smooth surfaces easily cleaned. Finally, you looked at the china hutch, its glass doors reflecting the overhead light. The good set, the one with the delicate rose pattern, sat behind the glass, pristine and waiting. You realized, with a start, that you had not used it in weeks. The Sunday roast now seemed to warrant it, but the Saturday night Ed Sullivan meal did not. Even your compromise casserole, served on the everyday ceramics, had bypassed it. This was the small, tangible sign. The frequency of washing the good china had diminished, a minor domestic metric that spoke volumes. Its delicate patterns were no longer subjected to the weekly wear of Tuesday pot roasts or Thursday meatloaves. It was reserved, elevated by its scarcity, for the occasions that still demanded the full, old-world ritual. Its less frequent journey from hutch to table to sink was a quiet admission. A portion of your family's life had permanently migrated to a more casual shore. The tray had not replaced the table, but it had carved out a significant and enduring territory beside it. Drying the last plate, you placed it in the cupboard. Your gaze drifted back to the living room, where the folded tray tables now leaned against the wall by the closet. Their task complete, they were no longer strange interlopers but integrated tools, as much a part of the evening's rhythm as the television guide or the sofa cushions. The children's request was not a rejection of your homemade casserole, but an embrace of the complete experience they had come to enjoy, the good food and the comfortable modern context for eating it. The cultural shift was not a dramatic earthquake, but a slow, steady redrawing of the domestic map. The kitchen remained the heart, but its arteries now extended into the living room, carrying sustenance on aluminum and laminate, and the family's life had comfortably, irrevocably expanded to fill the new space. The light was different now, not the warm, buttery glow of the old kitchen's pendant lamp over a simmering pot, but the stark, clinical brilliance of a single fluorescent bar embedded in the ceiling of a vast, brushed steel appliance. It hummed a low, steady note of refrigeration, a mechanical lullaby. You stood before the open freezer, a cavern of cold white and frostless shelves, the modern chill washing over your face in a dry wave. Inside lay not a few packages of meat and a lonely box of peas, but a curated landscape of frozen potential. Neat stacks of rectangular boxes, each a different colour-coded promise. Lasagna with 3 cheeses, fried chicken with waffle shapes, macaroni and cheese in a creamy sauce, teriyaki bowls with vegetable medleys. And there, tucked in the corner, a familiar red and yellow box, a Swanson turkey dinner, now just one soldier in a vast multinational army of convenience. Your hand, marked with the gentle topography of years, rested on the cool stainless steel door. The gesture was the same, the reaching, the selecting, but the world from which you chose was unrecognizable. The Tuesday pot roast was a memory preserved in the amber of another century. Its scent a ghost in the amber of another century. The aluminum tray, once a shocking interloper, was now a universal given. Its compartmentalized geometry, the foundational blueprint for 1,000 different meals. You did not feel guilt, nor rebellion, nor even the quiet triumph of time reclaimed. You felt the weight of the quiet transformation, the cumulative effect of 1,000,000 small choices made in 1,000,000 kitchens, just like this one, yours among them. The TV dinner did not destroy family life. That was the simplistic. Fear the lament of editorialists and traditionalists. It transformed it, with the subtle, relentless force of a river changing its course over decades. It renegotiated the contract between care and time. The unyielding 6 o'clock gathering, with its porcelain and its protocol, had softened, diversified. Togetherness now wore many faces, the rushed, companionable silence over individual microwaved bowls before soccer practice, the Friday night pizza delivered in a cardboard box and eaten from paper plates during a movie, the Sunday dinner, still cherished but now a conscious choice rather than a mandatory rite. The family table had not vanished, but it now shared its symbolic power with the sofa, the breakfast bar, the minivan's cup holders. Connection was measured in shared laughter at a screen, in the parallel quiet of homework done at the kitchen island, while a frozen lasagna heated, in the car ride conversations that now happened because no one was stuck at home stirring a pot. There were trade-offs, of course. The deep, layered flavour born of patient simmering was often sacrificed for the bright, immediate hit of salt and umami engineered in a lab. The tactile knowledge of food, the feel of a ripe tomato, the sound of a knife through a crisp carrot was exchanged for the skill of reading microwave wattage and peel-back film tabs. The ritual of preparation, once a meditative, productive solitude, was frequently replaced by a different kind of hustle. Yet, the time yielded was real. It became the hour for helping with a science project, for attending a recital, for a long phone call with a friend, for simply sitting with a book while the oven hummed its efficient, impersonal song. The definition of made with love expanded to include the choice to be present, even if the meal itself was assembled by distant, anonymous hands. The kitchen itself was reshaped. The once central stove, the altar of the home, now shared its dominion with the microwave, a humming cube that performed minor miracles in minutes. Counter space was devoted to the toaster oven, the electric can opener, the bread machine. The pantry held sauces in jars, pre-chopped vegetables in cans, seasoned rice in packets. The kitchen was no longer solely a workshop for raw materials, but a command center for the assembly and deployment of pre-engineered components. It became a more democratic space too, with the alchemy of cooking demystified into heating instructions. Everyone, husbands, teenagers, could participate in the nightly miracle of a hot meal, further unraveling the old singular thread of duty that had once bound the homemaker. And the palate, that too, was quietly, permanently altered. A generation grew up for whom the smooth, uniform texture of processed potatoes was the default, for whom gravy came in a silken, lump-free pour, for whom the combination of sweet corn and salty fish sticks was a fundamental taste of childhood. The bold, singular flavours of mass-produced food, the tang of powdered cheese, the smoky punch of artificial bacon, the cloying sweetness of canned fruit syrup, became comfort, nostalgia. The aluminum tray introduced America, bite by compartmentalized bite, to a new culinary language of consistency, convenience, and engineered satisfaction. It prepared the way for everything that followed, from fast food to fusion cuisine, by breaking the absolute link between time spent and flavor earned. You closed the freezer door, and the night vanished, leaving only your reflection in the dark steel. A face from the age of the Dutch oven looking back, from the age of the microwave. The journey from that first furtive box in a brand new supermarket to this fully stocked fortress of convenience spanned a lifetime of quiet revolutions. The simple aluminum tray was never just a piece of packaging. It was a Trojan horse, carrying into the heart of the home a new set of values: speed over slowness, individuality over unity, choice over obligation. It did not erase the old world, it built a new one right beside it, and the American family, pragmatic and adaptable, learnt to live in both. The legacy was not in the freezer's cold light, but in the warm, complicated, time-pressed life that light now served. It was in the freedom to choose a pot roast for Sunday and a tray for Tuesday, and to know that both, in their own way, could be a kind of nourishment. The hum of the appliance was the sound of that choice. A quiet, perpetual monument to the revolution that was not televised, but was most certainly eaten in front of it.